Hello everybody, and welcome to this second session in the induction, focusing on moving from novice to expert. My name is Liz Carroll and I'm a development lead for Teach First. I recommend you have your workbooks or pen and paper handy and give yourself about an hour to work through this session, and I'm going to be encouraging you to pause the video every now and then to do your own reflections and write your own notes. I really hope you enjoy what I think is a really valuable session, which should help you to think deeply about how you can support your ECT to make really strong progress. As a starting point, reflect in your workbook and complete this sentence. An effective mentor is. Pause the video now to give yourself a chance to write some notes, just thinking instinctively about what good mentoring means to you at this moment in time. So let's take a look at the objectives. By the end of this session, you will understand how your early career teacher develops expertise in teaching and develop your understanding of effective mentoring. An effective mentor understands how their ECT will develop on multiple levels, with learning science being our starting point. Learning science is a key area in the early career framework and will be the focus of Module 2, How Pupils Learn, for your ECT in the second autumn half term. We'll begin today with a brief retrieval quiz, modelling the use of ECF statement 2H, which is to increase likelihood of material being retained by balancing exposition, repetition, practice and retrieval of critical knowledge and skills. So the ECF draws on Professor Daniel Willingham's simple memory model as a way of breaking down and representing the enormous complexity of the mind. A caveat that, like any model, it has limitations, supporters and critics. So let's take a look at the questions. Question 1. According to Willingham's simple memory model, there are 1, 2 or 3 key areas of the mind. Question 2. In this model, what is the site of conscious thought known as? And question 3. Information in the long-term memory is stored in a cluster known as a M, M or S. Just pause the video now for a moment to give yourself a chance to respond to those questions. So the correct answers are, for question 1, there are 2 key areas of the mind. Question 2 is working memory. And question 3, those missing words are mental, model and schema. Let's look now more closely at the simple memory model and how it can be used to help understand the development of your ECT. It's worth noting that during the development of the programme, learning science was an area that prospective mentors reported as being less confident with compared to other topics. So we'll hear later about how you can use the mentor assessment tool to support your development of knowledge and application of learning science. Let's recap some of the key points of the simple memory model. For those who are comfortable with this model, do take this time to consider the implications for the development of your ECT. You have a copy of this model on page 5 of your workbooks. A teacher is constantly processing visual and auditory stimuli from their environment continuously, and they pay attention to certain stimulus. As mentioned, in this model there are 2 key areas of the mind, the working memory and long-term memory. This information enters the working memory and is either forgotten or the long-term memory is accessed to retrieve other knowledge, store the information, and make decisions. A person's working memory capacity is limited. If too much information is processed at once, it can become overwhelmed, leading to cognitive overload, where much of the information is lost. Information is organised in a person's long-term memory in clusters of information known as mental models, which you may hear also referred to as schemata. As discussed, the distinction between mental model and schema is outside the scope of the early career framework. Mental models are cognitive structures that help retrieval and storage by grouping together meaningful knowledge that's used to understand an aspect of their environment. An example of a mental model would be a hospital. If you were shown a photograph of a hospital, even if you haven't seen it before, you recognise it as a hospital. This is because your long-term memory has mental models that have encoded what the concept of a hospital is. When presented with a photograph, the decision-making on whether it is a hospital or not is intuitive with little cognitive demand. Take a moment now to consider the implications of the theory of learning science and how this can be used to understand your ECT's learning and development. Pause the video for a bit of thinking time. When compared to an expert teacher, an ECT will have less complex mental models, with fewer links, as well as links that are weaker and have pockets of isolated knowledge. What is held in the long-term memory will influence how a teacher reacts to a situation. Take the example of classroom management. An expert teacher will have dealt with low-level disruption in the past and has learnt an appropriate response, such as using non-verbal cues, and a lot of this decision-making is automatic and intuitive. As a consequence, an expert teacher is essentially able to process greater amounts of information, as they have large stores of information in their long-term memory, which frees up capacity for more thoughtful decision-making. Research suggests that teachers make around 1,500 decisions per day, which can contribute to decision fatigue. This is amplified if a teacher is presented with new events that have not been experienced. This is an interesting aspect of teacher well-being that can be overlooked. A mentor can play an important role in this model by drawing the ECT's attention to the highest leverage area of their practice. They can support the building of mental models with a range of strategies such as asking probing questions to connect the previous learning and use of modelling to support deliberate practice. So we've begun to identify the differences between your ECT and an expert teacher, but what does it mean to be an expert? On screen is the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition, also known as the novice to expert continuum, that developed in the 1980s to conceptualise how learners acquire new skills through 5 stages from novice to expert. We will revisit this model again in future mentor training sessions, as it can be a helpful lens to consider how your ECT will develop. Please pause the video now and just take a moment to have a look at this slide in relation to your ECT. As mentioned by Ruben in the earlier session, teaching is a highly complex discipline. As with the simple memory model, this model is a simplification, with our interest focused on how it relates to your ECT. In a moment, we will consider how the previous slide on learning science can be applied here, but for now, let us think about what we mean by a novice and an expert. As you can see, the knowledge, decision-making and awareness develop along this continuum from novice to expert as a teacher gains expertise. It is important to distinguish that we are not talking about experience or years teaching in this model. We are talking about expertise. Experience does not equal expertise. In your workbook, you've got a copy of this model on page 5. Please pause the video and take the next 5 minutes to discuss the 2 questions on the screen. Read the descriptions for each level. Where would you place an early career teacher on this continuum? Is it as simple as pigeonholing them in one category? And how useful is this model? Can you think of any advantages and disadvantages of this model? Pause the video now to think about those questions. So let's have a think now about what we can take away from these two models in terms of considering your ECT's development. What can we learn from bridging the previous two models of learning science and the novice to expert continuum? A teacher is neither an expert or novice. They have areas of their practice where they have more expertise than others. ECTs will be encountering some areas or domains for the first time. These areas will have very limited mental models. They are more likely to be cognitively overloaded in these areas. And as mentioned, the role of the mentor to support the building of mental models is highly important, such as connecting to previous knowledge, role modelling, and paying attention to what you want your ECT to learn. So mentors can play a significant role in supporting the learning of an early career teacher. What factors will you need to consider that may influence their development? An important aspect of developing your ECT is understanding individual and contextual factors that affect learning. We go through a similar process in teaching when we learn about factors that may influence a pupil's learning and motivation, enabling more effective adaptive teaching and individualised support. Individualisation is a really important role of the mentor on the Early Career Framework programme. Your ECT will be accessing self-directed study materials, and you will need to help your ECT to apply it to their previous experience and specific classroom context. On the screen are 4 areas that could potentially impact the development of your ECT's expertise over the next 2 years. Firstly, training routes vary by school placement lengths and type. Secondly, COVID-19 may have placed significant impacts on teachers entering the profession, both positive and negative. Next, ECTs may be put in a place of tension in their new role as an ECT, such as if they are balancing their pastoral responsibilities with the ECF programme. And finally, their previous experience of work or working with young children will also likely affect their learning. Please take a few moments now to consider factors that might influence the development of your ECT along these 4 areas. How do they relate to the content already covered in this session? Pause the video to give yourself some time to give this some thought. So as we have mentioned, appreciating factors that affect the development of expertise in your ECT will enable you to individualise your support and be a more effective mentor. Before moving on to consider another aspect of effective mentoring, it's worth reminding ourselves of the importance of mentoring within the Early Career Framework programme. Take a look at the graph on the screen, taken from a report by the Sutton Trust into the impact of teachers on pupil outcomes. I'll just pause for a moment for you to take in the information on the graph. If you in some way contribute to your ECT improving as a teacher, just consider the impact that you'll be having on the hundreds or potentially thousands of pupils your ECT will go on to teach. The Early Career Framework sits at the heart of the Department for Education's recruitment and retention strategy, and it's hoped by providing the foundations of effective teaching, your ECT is more likely to stay in the profession and thrive, rather than just survive, the early stages of their new career. We're now going to move on to hear from Ben Riley about another important aspect of mentoring. Let's take a look at this first video.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Riley, the founder and executive director of an organization called Deans for Impact, and we work to ensure that all future teachers are well prepared as they start their career. We're based in the United States, hence my accent, but I've had a chance to come over to the UK on a few occasions and talk to teachers about our work. And I'll always remember the one teacher who said to me, "Oh, are you the folks who put out those helpful green pamphlets?" So it's true, we have some helpful green pamphlets around the science of learning and how to be an effective teacher that are available on our website, free of charge. But really, I'm here today to talk to you about effective mentoring. Deans for Impact has partnered with Teach First to think about how to design a mentoring program in ways that will ensure that both the mentors and the early career teachers are best positioned to help the students that they're going to teach. So today, we're really going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk briefly about why effective mentoring matters. And then second, we'll take a look at an actual classroom example of teaching and think about what sort of feedback a mentor should and should not give to the teacher in question. So with that, let's dive in. So, effective mentoring, why does it matter? Well, let's take it outside of the classroom context just for a second and think about when you're trying to learn any new skill. In fact, let's think about learning the skill of bicycle riding. And take a moment now with me to watch an early career cyclist beginning to learn this complex skill. So, what would you say?
So now, take a little bit of time to think what you would say to this novice bike rider. You can discuss this if you're with somebody else, or just take a few moments to think this through on your own. Pause the video to give it some thought. Okay, let's hear if Ben agrees with your thinking.
The answer is not obvious, right? You can tell that something's going wrong. In fact, many things are going wrong, but it's not exactly clear what it is they need to know in order to be improving at what they're doing. And this is really the challenge of teaching too. Teaching, like bicycle riding, involves an awful lot of knowledge that may not be easy to explain. The philosopher Michael Polanyi called this tacit knowledge, the knowledge that you simply possess but may struggle to convey to others. So what we're doing here today is trying to break through that challenge and look at ways in which you can effectively mentor by identifying specific skills and practices in teaching, and then providing specific information to novice teachers that will help them improve. So, what does effective mentoring look like? Well, here are a few principles that you're surely already familiar with at some level that make someone more effective as a mentor if they have a robust understanding of it. The real challenge is breaking this down into what exactly does it mean to provide effective feedback or to promote dialogue. We'll explore that in a second, but what I want to underscore here is that all of these ideas, all of these principles are supported in learning science. And one of the things that makes learning science really powerful is that it's applicable at all levels. And what I mean by that is that the science of how pupils learn from teachers is the same science of how novice teachers will learn from mentor teachers. So in many ways, if we grasp these principles and apply them properly in mentoring, we're really modeling those principles for novice teachers so that they may use them when they then go and begin their careers teaching as well. So there's real power in showing and applying this science from the very get-go. One of the things that the science tells us, and that's very important, is that not try to take on everything all at once and to not try to get better at all 5 of these all at once, and instead isolate and focus on a specific skill that you want to get better at within the context of mentoring. And that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to focus on one specific skill, the skill of feedback. So, how does one provide effective feedback? Well, in the context of learning science, we talk about how important it is to use practice in order to get better at something, but not all practice is equivalent. And in fact, it's very important when you're practicing something, as I mentioned earlier, to isolate the specific skill you want to get better at, and then to get effective feedback in order to improve. Well, that just begs the question, what makes feedback effective? Well, first, the feedback has to be closely tied and directed to the task at hand and the goal you're trying to achieve. And second, there have to be opportunities to use that feedback and practice again in order to improve. If you simply give feedback without giving the opportunity to someone to actually make use of it and try again, you're not giving them the opportunity to actually encode that learning and make it deeper so that they'll be able to use it in the future.
So Ben has mentioned the qualities of effective mentors, which draws upon the National Framework for Mentoring and Coaching, identifying qualities of an effective mentor. Look back now at what you wrote right at the start of this session, when we asked you to consider the end of the sentence starter, an effective mentor is. Does your definition reflect these 5 qualities on the screen? Can you already identify your own strengths and weaknesses against these 5 areas? Do pause the video now to reflect for a short time on your strengths and weaknesses as you perceive them to be at the moment. We're now going to rejoin Ben as he focuses on one of these 5 areas, providing feedback.
So, with that in mind, we're actually going to use a classroom example to explore what effective feedback can look like and what ineffective feedback can look like. When you watch this video, please watch with kindness. You're watching an actual teacher with actual students. Understand that the skill, as I'm sure you all know, of teaching is incredibly complex. And so even though we're going to have some things to say, some critical things to say about this teacher, we still honor and respect what they're doing there. At the same time, as you watch, please think about what is the purpose of the task that this teacher is providing to their students, and based on what you know about teaching and what you know about feedback, what would you say to this teacher afterwards?
Today we're going to read a story called Miss Nelson is Missing. And this vocabulary is part of the story. You can repeat after me. Misbehaving.
Misbehaving.
Arithmetic.
Arithmetic.
Know-it-all. The kids in room 207 were misbehaving again. Spitballs stuck to the ceiling. Paper planes whizzed through the air. They were the worst behaved class in the whole school. They whispered and giggled. They squirmed and made faces. They were even rude during story hour. Something will have to be done, said Miss Nelson. I'm going to stop it here. Miss Nelson is going to go missing. What happens when pets go missing? Kevin?
When pets get missing, they put posters of them in the streets.
Because you love your pets and you want to find them. So we're going to be doing a poster where you put the picture of Miss Nelson. What color is her hair?
Blonde.
Blonde. What color dress is she wearing? Very nice.
So at Deans for Impact, we like to use something called examples and non-examples to illustrate concepts. And so here we really want to use an example and a non-example of effective feedback in the context of teaching. And before continuing, I'll just say that an important principle from learning science is that teachers should focus on what it is the content that they want their students to remember, and how is it that the tasks and activities that they've designed will actually get students to remember the content. So having watched the video of this teacher, let's take a look at what we would call a non-example of effective feedback and what it consists of. So this first piece of feedback sounds nice, and frankly, maybe the sort of feedback that is commonplace in education. But when you sort of look below the surface features here, you start to see some things that are, we'll say, not optimal. For example, the teacher's praising the mentor teacher is praising the teacher for having engaged students. But the question is, engaged in what? Were they engaged in learning the vocabulary, which was the target of the lesson, or were they engaged in making a poster and cutting things out and using markers? The other challenge here too is that there's general praise for what the teacher did, but it doesn't really tell them why or how they could get better. It's just sort of generically saying, job well done. Again, when you have the opportunity for feedback, there is almost always an opportunity to improve. And so always when providing feedback, you should look for ways in which you can give specific targeted information to the novice teacher so that they may then go and try again and practice to get better. So here we have an example of effective feedback. And what makes it effective? Well, note that the mentor teacher is focusing on what was the goal of the lesson, learning the vocabulary, and then identifying, was the activity aligned to that goal? Is drawing a poster really allowing students to engage with the content they want to engage them with? And in addition to that, this mentor teacher has said, let's actually develop a plan for what you might do differently, and then gives this novice teacher the opportunity, or at least lays the door open for the opportunity to go and practice it again to get better. This is an example of what effective mentoring really looks like.
So what were some of the features of effective mentoring highlighted by Ben? Has the mentor paid attention to pupil learning and what they are attending to? Engagement and enjoyment are poor proxies for learning. Linking the objectives to the lesson can inform observations of what pupils are paying attention to. Example, drawing a poster. Paying attention to the gap between aims and objectives, the ECT can be prompted to reflect on the lack of alignment. And by planning and practice, the teacher would have the opportunity to make changes and practice there and then to get better. So through this session, we've been able to consider how your ECT will learn as a professional and imply the lens of learning science and the novice to expert continuum. We've taken the time to think about factors that may influence the development of your ECT's expertise and how you might individualise your mentoring. And finally, we've watched Ben Riley explain the qualities of effective mentoring and take a look at how to provide effective feedback, which we will examine in greater detail after the break. Take a moment now to think about how this session started. If I asked you to write down an effective mentor is, again, what would you write down now? So through this programme, you will have the opportunity to not only support the development of teaching expertise of your ECT and yourself, but your mentoring expertise as well. We now have a little time, so do pause the video and reflect on what you are going to take away from the first two sessions. Thank you very much for your attention today. I hope you've enjoyed the session.